Why would an animal leave the open ocean, turn away from food, and walk across frozen sea ice just as Antarctica enters its most brutal season? Every year, emperor penguins make that journey. They move toward breeding colonies on the sea ice, where temperatures can plunge far below freezing and violent winds can make survival a constant battle. There is no easy meal waiting for them, no comfortable shelter, and for the males, the journey ends with an extraordinary sacrifice. Standing for weeks with a single egg resting on their feet, while living almost entirely on energy stored in their bodies. It sounds like a terrible strategy, but it isn't a mistake. The timing is the entire point. Emperor penguins have evolved to begin raising their chicks during the Antarctic winter, a season when conditions are at their most severe. So why choose this moment? Why breed when food is far away, darkness dominates the landscape, and the sea itself is locked beneath ice? And perhaps the strangest question of all, what does the winter give these penguins that summer cannot? To answer that, we have to follow them onto the frozen sea ice and uncover the seasonal timing that keeps bringing them back. The journey begins long before the first egg appears. As the Antarctic autumn advances, emperor penguins leave the feeding grounds where they have spent months building their energy reserves. Their destination is not the deep interior of the continent, but a familiar breeding area on frozen sea ice, a temporary platform that must remain in place long enough for the breeding cycle to unfold. The ice is not simply a road. It is part of the environment their reproduction depends on. Too much change at the wrong stage can disrupt access to the colony, feeding routes, or the conditions needed to raise a chick. And because the sea ice itself is seasonal, the penguins must begin their journey with the clock already running. Then comes the remarkable part. Each female produces a single egg during the breeding attempt. There is no second egg waiting to replace it. After laying, she carefully transfers the egg to the male, who balances it on his feet and covers it with his brood pouch to protect it from the freezing surface. Then the female turns back toward the ocean. She must rebuild her own energy reserves, find food, and eventually return with nourishment for the chick. The male stays behind. His next meal may be weeks away. But why would natural selection favor such a risky division of labor? Because the answer lies in timing, and the next stage of the journey will push that strategy to its absolute limit. For the male emperor penguin, the colony becomes a waiting room with no easy exit. Once the egg is transferred to him, he balances it on top of his feet and covers it with the brood pouch, a fold of skin and feathers that shields the egg from the freezing air and ice below. He cannot simply walk away when conditions become unbearable. The egg must remain protected until the embryo completes its development. Around him, thousands of other males face the same impossible task. Then, the weather closes in. Temperatures fall, winds intensify, and darkness stretches across the colony for days at a time. The penguins do not survive this exposure alone. They turn toward one another. The colony compresses into a dense huddle, creating a moving barrier against the wind. Birds near the exposed edges lose heat more quickly, while those farther inside gain some protection. But the arrangement never stays fixed. The huddle constantly shifts as individuals adjust their positions, allowing different birds to spend time in more exposed and more protected areas. No single bird commands the movement. The behavior emerges from thousands of small adjustments repeated across the colony. Yet even this remarkable system cannot solve every problem. The cold demands energy, and the males cannot replace what their bodies are spending. They entered the breeding season with substantial fat reserves, and now those reserves become their primary fuel. That stored energy keeps their own bodies functioning and allows them to maintain the warmth required for successful incubation. The developing embryo receives its nutrients from the egg itself. Week after week, the male waits, losing energy while the chick grows inside its shell. Every gram of reserve matters. And eventually, the question becomes unavoidable. How long can his body keep paying the cost? As the weeks accumulate, the male begins to feel the price of his decision. His stored reserves are shrinking, yet he still has to maintain his body temperature and keep the egg safely incubated beneath his brood pouch. The egg itself contains the nutrients needed by the developing embryo. The father's role is to provide the warmth, protection, and stability that allow that development to continue. Movements that once seemed effortless become increasingly costly. Every adjustment requires energy. Every hour outside the relative protection of the huddle takes something from a body that cannot replace it. And while the male remains on the ice, another clock is running far away at sea. The female has her own problem to solve. After leaving the colony, she must find enough prey to restore her depleted reserves, sustain the journey back, and eventually provide food for the chick. Her own survival and the chick's future are now tied to the success of that feeding trip. She cannot return empty. So, while the male endures the fast, the female is hunting in a vast and unpredictable ocean, gathering the energy that will soon be needed at the colony. Neither parent can complete the task alone. Then, after weeks of separation, movement appears on the horizon. Females begin returning to the breeding colony. But there is a problem. The colony may contain thousands of nearly identical birds packed together, calling over one another in a deafening mass of sound. A returning mother cannot simply look across the crowd and know where her family is. Somewhere among all those penguins are her mate and the chick she has been separated from. So she listens. Adult penguins produce distinctive calls that help partners locate and recognize one another within the crowded colony. The reunion is not a quiet moment of recognition. It is a search through thousands of competing voices until one familiar call finally answers. For the exhausted male, that sound means the wait is almost over. But the hardest part remains. The chick is beginning to hatch, and it must be transferred safely from one parent to the other. Then, after months of cold and waiting, something changes beneath the male's feathers. A faint sound comes from the egg. The chick has begun to hatch. For the first time, the male is no longer protecting only an embryo sealed inside a shell. He is caring for a fragile newborn that now depends on its parents for warmth, protection, and eventually food. The timing is critical. His stored reserves have been steadily depleted, while the female is making her way back from the ocean with energy for herself and the chick. If her return comes too late, the male can be pushed dangerously close to the limits of his reserves. But when the females finally approach the colony, another challenge begins. The colony erupts into noise. Thousands of penguins call from every direction, creating a wall of sound across the ice. Somewhere inside that crowd, one female must find her mate. She cannot rely on appearance alone. Instead, she listens for the distinctive vocal pattern that helps her locate and recognize her partner. After weeks apart, those familiar calls become a biological address, guiding her through the chaos until the two finally locate each other. Then comes the transfer. The male carefully moves the chick toward the female while keeping it protected above the frozen surface. She positions herself close to him and brings the chick beneath her own brood pouch. For a few tense moments, the newborn is being passed between two exhausted parents, and the freezing ice remains dangerously close. Then the female takes its weight. The chick is safe. For the male, that changes everything. His months of incubation are over, and he can finally return to the ocean to replenish the energy he has lost. His body has surrendered a substantial portion of its stored energy, but the journey back to the sea begins now. He turns away from the breeding ground and starts the long trek toward food, while the female takes over the next stage of raising their chick. The male has survived the fast. The egg has survived the winter. But the chick's greatest challenge is only beginning. It must grow strong enough to leave the protection of the brood pouch and eventually enter the ocean that its parents depend on.